And now we have three featured speakers today, Professors Chris Skipwith, Rob DeLeo, and Danielle Hartigan. Chris Skipwith is an assistant professor of biotechnology in the Department of Natural and Applied Sciences and a visiting lecturer in biotechnology programs at Northeastern University. Chris's research seeks to link the development of novel devices for point-of-care diagnostics with studies of policy, patenting, business, and public health implications. In addition to his teaching and research endeavors, Chris is a scientific content reviewer for the American Society for Microbiology, ASM, COVID-19 Research Registry, which I'll be talking about today, which includes top-ranked COVID-19 research articles curated by experts and serves as a resource for scientists working together to address fundamental science and accelerate scientific research on SARS-CoV-2. Chris is a co-investigator for the NIH-funded Annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minority Students. The abbreviation is ABRCMS, coordinating education and training resources for research trainees. Rob DeLeo is an associate professor of public policy at Bentley University and a visiting fellow in the program on crisis leadership at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. His research focuses on preparedness policymaking. His most recent book, Anticipatory Policymaking, When Governments Act to Prevent Problems and Why It Is So Difficult, examines the dynamics of policy change in anticipation of emergent hazards like novel diseases and other types of slow onset events. His work has also appeared in Policy Studies Journal, Policy and Politics, Critical Policy Studies, Polity, as well as various other peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. And fun fact, Rob was our host of our very first 2020 virtual event. So it's a nice bookend here. And lastly, Danielle serves as both an associate professor in the Natural and Applied Sciences Department and is director of Bentley's Health Thought Leadership Network, a multidisciplinary network of over 60 Bentley faculty and staff that bridges traditional boundaries of academia and industry to advance Bentley's health-related research and educational opportunities. Danielle has a PhD in social psychology from Northeastern University and a Master of Public Health from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Danielle is also a former cancer prevention fellow in the Behavioral Research Program at the National Cancer Institute. The central goal of her interdisciplinary research in psychology and public health is to improve the patient and practitioner experience and foster patient-centered care through better communication. Rob and Danielle are both members of the Risk and Social Policy Working Group, a team of scholars from 10 universities in 8 states. And they'll be sharing more on that shortly. So without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Professors Skipwith, DeLeo, and Hartigan. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. So as Emily mentioned, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Natural and Applied Sciences at Bentley, and also a scientific content reviewer for the ASM COVID-19 Research Registry, which I've been doing since about the beginning of our shutdown. So I actually started at the beginning of April. So I'll present some general guidance, and my hope is that following this entire section, you'll see that it's clear that a vaccine is needed to prevent the dynamics of this pandemic that we have experienced over the past year. And from an individual standpoint, a COVID-19 vaccine that is effective and safe would reduce the severity of illness and perhaps prevent infection and impede upon viral transmission that would help the community and make it safer for us to resume our normal day-to-day activities. So I'll start with a brief sort of explanation of the scientific publishing process. That way you can get the work that we've done with the COVID-19 Research Registry. So we are now 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this time, US government officials and scientists still disagree over basic safety guidance on the coronavirus. People are still disregarding key public health advice. And we're still seeing leading public health organizations revise their understanding of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. But the fact that messaging from public health and scientific experts has changed during the pandemic is actually a sign of progress, and it's not completely unexpected. Before the pandemic, scientists knew of several other types of coronaviruses that could infect humans, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But until this SARS-CoV-2 began to make people sick, scientists had never really needed to study how this particular virus attacks the human body. And now, as researchers study COVID-19 at breakneck speeds, one key aspect to keep in mind is that the research is happening while everyone watches. And so the public is getting front row seats to the scientific method, probably in a way they never imagined they would have experienced. And so the short story is that science is an arduous process. Generally speaking, the scientific method entails getting acquainted with substantial amounts of information just to be able to formulate a hypothesis to explore mystery. With that body of knowledge under their belts, scientists can then move on to investigating research questions with clever experiments, and then publishing articles that report their scientific findings in academic journals. But before a journal publishes those findings, virtually all aspects of a study or paper are evaluated by scientists who are top experts in their own niches of the scientific community. And this system, known as peer review, isn't flawless, but it's been the hallmark of research for decades. And if a faulty study does make it through, the study could be retracted or at least highly debated and reanalyzed. And depending on the type of journal and how many revisions the initial manuscript needs, publishing scientific findings can take several months. But now that the entire world is rushing to find treatments and vaccines and diagnostics for coronavirus, scientists are trying to share their findings as quickly as possible. And to speed the process of sharing new science, many researchers have turned to preprints, which are scientific reports released publicly online before going through the aforementioned peer review process. And during the pandemic, scientists have swamped preprint servers with new research. And the science in those preprints can help researchers communicate among each other and generate important collaborations. But they can also be a double-edged sword in that papers based on unvetted science can reach the public eye, which can become dangerous fake news and influence public policy with flawed research. And so this led to the introduction of the COVID-19 Research Registry because there was a clear, urgent nature of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that posed many challenges for science. And the accumulation of published peer-reviewed research and these preprint server research, and even data sets that are coming from research coming out about SARS-CoV-2 necessitated a effort from the scientific community to have a one-stop shop of authoritative information of fundamental research on SARS-CoV-2. And so this would encourage rapid scientific discovery and innovation, increasing the chances of developing something that could defeat the virus and end the pandemic. And so ASM took the charge of creating the COVID-19 Research Registry and responding to this need. So briefly, I'm just showing some of the categories and subcategories of COVID-19 research. We have curation and review teams that are tied to each one of these areas, and I'll focus on the prevention area, which talks about virus inactivation, passive and induced immunity, and then of course, vaccine design and development, which is the topic of this entire session that we're in. So just a little bit about the selection, curation, and posting process. We got articles every single day, and on the average of about 1,000 articles per day that we were actually going through. And this was actually accumulated by a preprint server and also published article accumulator or aggregator called the CZI metadatabase. And so the articles were sorted into categories and subcategories, and then our team that was tied to one of those categories or subcategories then reviewed. And then we had a secondary review by expert curators. These recommendations from the curators were sent to the curator in chief, and then the CIC would actually select the articles that would go onto the registry. We also looked at new data sets and unpublished materials as well that would go into this. And so just to kind of give you a sense of the volume, I'm going to show you some numbers that we got from it. So if you look at just my section specifically, from April 2020 to December 11th, 2020, we received about 17,000 total articles that we reviewed, and it's actually a little over that now. If you look at the articles that were reviewed that were based on the basic biology of SARS-CoV-2, so this is understanding the biology from April 2020 until December 11th, it was about 2.4 thousand. And if you look at the articles that were reviewed on vaccine development specifically, it was about 1,900. And of those, about 739 were based on knowledge that was generated since April of 2020. So this is a fast moving process. And I hope these numbers convey that to you. Now I'm going to go over some lessons that we learned from this work on the registry. The first is that current progress on vaccines is fueled by decades of basic science. The second is that high quality protein is the beginning to fighting the pandemic, and you'll see how it can be applied in many different areas, including vaccines. Third is that new technologies are transforming vaccinology, and this is the basis of the two vaccines that have, in one case, been recommended for emergency use authorization, and in the other case, is actually being distributed now. And then there are unanswered questions about basic biology that fuel uncertainty about vaccines. So just a little primer before we get into it. The vaccine target for coronavirus is called the spike protein. And this spike protein sits on the surface of coronaviruses, and their entire purpose is to mediate attachment to a host cell. So on the right, you'll see a cell in the human body, and there's a human cell receptor identified in orange. And you can see that the area on the spike protein is called the RBD, or receptor binding domain, and it binds to the human cell receptor. And following that, there is a series of things that happen that cause the virus spike protein to change a bit, which then causes fusion and enables the virus to get inside the cell. And then it starts to replicate, and now you're infected and could potentially get the disease. So the purpose of a vaccine is to elicit immune response, and it's been shown in vaccine development for SARS to be mostly an antibody response to the spike protein. And the antibodies are meant to block the spike protein from binding the cell and then impede infection. So I just want to go way back in time to the beginning of coronavirus research, just to kind of quickly show you how all the things we've learned have accumulated over time and made it possible for warp speed development in the vaccine. So back in the 60s and 70s, scientists knew about OC43 and 229E, and these are two human coronaviruses that cause the common cold. And since then, there's been research going on by a rather small group of people on other coronaviruses. It's basically the mouse hepatitis virus model virus, and other animal viruses that are important pathogens in things like cows, pigs, and birds. The basic SARS-CoV biology and general coronavirus biology actually extended until about 2002, which was when the first SARS emerged in China. So back in 1977, the spike protein was first identified, and it was called E2 at the time. We learned that the spike protein attaches to a receptor that's actually an entry protein in 81. In 85, we learned there was a cleavage site, and the site had to be cleaved in order for the virus to fuse and enter cells. In 1987, the first coronavirus genome was sequenced, and we actually saw the first sequence of the spike gene, which was very important for these mRNA vaccines now coming out. In 1991, the mouse hepatitis receptor was identified, and this is, I think, one of the first viral receptors, but certainly the first coronavirus receptor that was identified. The first genetic system was identified in 1992, and so scientists could actually manipulate the genome in 1994. And the receptor binding domain of this mouse hepatitis virus was identified. And of course, this was really important. Then in 2000, the first full-length clone of a coronavirus was developed. And so with all this information, when SARS came out in 2002, it was very sequenced, quickly cloned, and identified. And that was the beginning of the lethal human respiratory viruses period as we know them. And in the wake of SARS, scientists learned that bats were a major reservoir for coronavirus and other viruses. And that's becoming a really important thing to understand. People identify other human coronaviruses that are non-lethal diseases. And so things were kind of stagnant for a while until we had the MERS coronavirus that emerged in Saudi Arabia in 2012. And so it was very quickly identified using the information from the past 40 years. So then things were quiet again until we had, of course, SARS-CoV-2. And obviously we should have expected this after having the other outbreaks. And SARS-CoV-2 was identified and sequenced in record time again because of everything we knew. So this just shows a figure of the sort of genetic sort of relationships between these SARS viruses, and highlighted in red are those that are associated with the first SARS outbreak and then the MERS outbreak. And then the ones that are actually written in red are those sequences that are associated with this new SARS-CoV-2. And just a little bit on the epidemiology, SARS and MERS did not affect nearly as many people as our current pandemic is impacting. So just to put that into perspective for you. So there are many pathways to actually acquire antibody responses, and they are sort of threefold. The first way is that you get infected, and a person would get infected with SARS-CoV-2. However, there are outcomes that may be detrimental following that infection. Obviously, severe illness with the likelihood of death albeit for this particular virus, it's to a low extent. And then also, we don't really understand much about acquiring immunity following SARS-CoV infection. The literature has data that shows variable antibody responses. There are anecdotes around particular individuals getting reinfected as well. So there's really a lot to learn about immunity from infection. Of course, the second way, which we're going to focus on, is vaccination. And this is the use of rationally designed vaccines that can come in various shapes and colors, so to speak. So there are subunit proteins, nanoparticles, gene-based delivery, but the purpose of a vaccine is to elicit antibody responses that will then prevent one from being infected or acquiring severe disease. The third way you may have heard is through direct administration. And if you follow the news, you may have heard of Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibody that was given emergency use authorization. And so this and an older therapy, which is called plasma therapy, can be used prophylactically or therapeutically. So there are several ways that immune responses can be acquired, but we're going to focus on vaccines. So the first lesson, high quality protein is important. Understanding the protein sequence and understanding the high quality information tied to that protein can enable things like therapies, like the Eli Lilly therapy you saw. Development of diagnostics, particularly from the CDC, were enabled by this high quality protein. And of course, the development of the many vaccines that are either approved conditionally or are in clinical trials. One of the really important things was that scientists had to learn about the way the protein looks prior to it binding to a cell, which is called the pre-fusion form. And this is the form of the protein that's used as the target for antibodies in eliciting immune response with the vaccine. And so preserving this sensitive version of the protein was essential for vaccine antigen design. And this work was done as early as 2008, and some of the major papers surrounding it came out in 2013. So using new technologies to transform vaccinology comes under really two basic umbrellas. The first of which is precision, and this precision is where you have things like structure-based vaccine development. The second is speed, and this is what we're looking at, where you incorporate rapid DNA synthesis, or in our case, messenger RNA. And so these mRNA vaccines that have been approved is basically, it delivers targeted genetic messages to the protein-making machineries of host cells. Both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines deliver mRNA that encodes a pre-fusion stabilized form of that spike protein. And so vaccination will initiate host production of the spike protein copies, which would then trigger the immune system to create antibodies in response to the foreign protein. mRNA vaccines are especially efficient to produce, and also they cause a heightened immune response that not only stimulates antibody production, but also induces T cell activity, which can then kill some of the virus. Now, for the purposes of our discussion, I'll focus on the Moderna vaccine, which was recently endorsed for emergency use authorization by an FDA advisory panel. And so one thing that's really important is that within 2 months of learning the sequence of the spike protein, Moderna was able to engineer enough vaccine to begin its first human trials. But the speedy production was not rushed, and I'll make sure to emphasize that. It's important to understand that COVID-19 vaccines are dependent upon and made possible by nearly 17 years of research. Finally, there are a number of questions surrounding front-runner COVID-19 vaccine candidates that remain unanswered. Some of these have to do with the biology of the virus and host immune system, including how long the virus may remain protective. Will boosters be needed? Will the vaccines be safe and effective in pregnant women and children? Scientists are actively researching this immunopathology of SARS-CoV-2, and new information about the longevity of immunity is emerging very quickly. One thing I'm making sure to note here is that this time for the vaccine coming out is giving us a lot of information regarding these unanswered questions. Some questions have to do with logistics of supply and demand. So how will the vaccine manufacturers and supply companies scale production to meet needs of the pandemic world? And then when will the vaccine be available and how will it be distributed? And then what I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk about has to do with public confidence and vaccine hesitancy. As case numbers continue to ebb and flow across the country, and many are experiencing local surges, wariness seems to be spreading as quickly as the virus itself. So thinking about, can we trust a vaccine that was developed so quickly? How do we address and prevent the recurrence of historical abuses in vaccine mishandling? And are there side effects that we should be concerned about? I'll end by saying, in order to address these concerns, scientists and production companies must be open and transparent with trial data, and scientists must address sources of vaccine hesitancy and misinformation directly. We must be honest about what we do not yet know and work to share the knowledge we do have in a way that empowers everyone to make informed decisions, which promote the health and well-being of ourselves and our communities. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. And can everyone see the slides? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob DeLeo, and I am going to be presenting alongside my colleague, Danielle Hartigan of the Department of Natural and Applied Sciences. And together we're part of a team known as the Risk and Social Policy Working Group. And actually reflecting on Emily's opener about the fact that, you know, it was my talk that kicked things off back in, I think it was March or April, Emily. It's incredible to think of how far we've come with our understanding of this particular pandemic, both in terms of vaccine development and diagnostics and treatments, but also in terms of the social dynamics of COVID-19, because as Chris so astutely pointed out, a vaccine's only an effective public health intervention if people actually choose to get it, which is where the Risk and Social Policy Working Group comes into play. Much like Chris, we were a team of scholars who around March were looking for ways to insert ourselves into this ongoing, both academic and applied effort to make sense of this pandemic and actually help policymakers and doctors and scientists in managing what has ultimately proven to be one of the most devastating public health events in over 100 years. The Risk and Social Policy Group is an interdisciplinary team of scholars. We span a number of subfields, including public policy, communication, public health, psychology. We even had an MD in our ranks for a little while. And really what we focus on is the public policy, individual risk perceptions and behaviors that are driving how governments are responding to and managing this pandemic. And what makes our work unique is that, of course, we're dedicated to advancing scholarly research in all of these areas, but we're also trying to do work that's disseminated in real time and can inform both political and public policy decisions, as well as ongoing public health efforts. And we've actually partnered with a number of states to inform their messaging and epidemiological modeling. Our work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the University of Colorado's Natural Hazard Center, Scholars Strategy Research Network, Bentley's Research Council, as well as the Bentley Health Thought Leadership Network, which Professor Hartigan happens to be the head of. Next slide, please. So the data I am going to talk about, that we're going to talk about today, is actually from our very first survey. It was a multi-wave panel survey that surveyed roughly 3,000 respondents from 6 different states: Colorado, Iowa, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Washington. And the reason we chose these 6 particular states is twofold. One, at the time we started this survey, all of these states were sort of having different COVID-19 experiences, where some of the states along the coast were having large-scale outbreaks. Others in the Midwest and parts of the South really hadn't been as impacted by the pandemic as greatly. Secondly, these states also differed in terms of the types of public policies they had in place to manage the pandemic back in March. So whereas some states had mask mandates, others largely shirked at the idea of requiring anyone to wear masks, let alone mandating that people in the general public do it. These states differed also in terms of the types of business closures that were required, school closures, and overall public health messaging. What sets our research apart from a lot of other survey-based research that's gone on over the course of the last 9 to 10 months is that our data is derived from a panel of survey respondents. And what that means is we went back to the same cohort of individuals 4 times since May. So our first wave was in May and June. Our second survey wave was in August. Our third survey wave was in October, and we most recently wrapped our fourth survey wave about a week ago. And what this panel approach allows us to do is it allows us to track changes in both risk perceptions and behaviors across time. So instead of just having a snapshot of a random selection of people at one point in time, we're able to see how risk perceptions and behaviors around the COVID-19 pandemic have evolved over the course of the last several months. Our survey was disseminated by Qualtrics, and Qualtrics implemented quotas to recruit a representative sample of each state's age, race, ethnicity, and income demographics. And as you can see from our sample characteristics from wave 1, they did a pretty good job recruiting respondents who more or less matched the composition of each of those states. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that with any panel survey, there's some attrition that occurs across time. So some of those sample characteristics have changed by wave 4. But that being said, we did go back and try to include some corrective measures to compensate for any losses in any of those areas that we stratified our survey back. Yes, next slide, please. Thank you. One of the clearest findings from our surveys to date, and this is consistent with a lot of literature that's come out around the social dynamics of COVID-19, is people are really afraid of this particular virus. In fact, they're so afraid that they actually tend to overestimate the risks associated with COVID-19. When asked about the likelihood of contracting COVID-19 in the next 3 months, on average, respondents indicated that they have a 29% chance of getting COVID-19. Among those, they indicated that if they get it, they have roughly a 34% chance of getting seriously ill, and then a 21% chance of dying from this particular virus. Now, it's really quite difficult to accurately calculate what those risks are. A testament to the fact that our testing in this country has been mediocre at best to date. But for some context here, roughly 3% of the US population has been officially diagnosed by COVID as being COVID positive. So you get a sense that people tend to probably overestimate some of these risks. And when probed further and asked, what would you need to do to go back to normal? Overwhelmingly, the response that most of our respondents gave was they need to have a vaccine. A vaccine is what's going to allow them to go back to work, to see family and friends and loved ones, to maybe go back to concerts and sporting events and large-scale gatherings. And so a vaccine really from the start of this pandemic among our respondents was seen as the most important public health intervention for getting them back to normal. Problematically, however, between the dates of between our May waves and our October waves, we actually saw a decline in the number of respondents who indicated that yes, they intended to get a vaccine when it became available. We have, however, observed a slight uptick in likelihood to get a vaccine, particularly in the wake of the 2020 presidential election. And so from wave 3 to wave 4, we saw an uptick from 39% yes to 45% yes, I will get a vaccine when it becomes available. And obviously, if we want to reach some level of herd immunity, we want to see those numbers continue to go up. But even that being said, if 45% less yes is still far lower than most public health officials would hope to have in order to have robust vaccination across the country. So having provided that primer on our work and key findings around intent to vaccinate, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Danielle Hartigan, who's going to briefly talk about some differences among subgroups.
Hey everyone, thanks so much, Rob. So as you said, I'm going to spend the next few minutes trying to dive a little bit deeper into this data, into our vaccine hesitancy data, to try to look at some different socio-demographic factors related to hesitancy across time, and also share with you some of our respondents' perceptions of government, science, and even the vaccine itself. There we go. So in this first slide, you can see vaccine intentions over time by various subgroups. And so this is the percentage of people who said, yes, they intend to get the vaccine when it is available. So in the top graph, you can see intent to vaccinate varied by political ideology. So liberals were more likely than moderates and conservatives to say they would get the vaccine, but their intention to do so decreased more between May and October. And interestingly, in our newest data, this is post-election data, in December, this showed that intention to get vaccinated increased across all ideologies, but most dramatically among liberals. The middle graph shows that intent to vaccinate decreased between May and October in all 6 states in our sample. So intent to vaccinate increased in all states for which we have complete data between October and December. So you can see Massachusetts, if you're interested, is shown here in the orange. And note that we're still collecting wave 4 responses from Iowa and Washington, so which is why they're not included in the wave 4 data set there. And so as of December, Louisiana respondents were least likely to report that they intended to get a vaccine, and Colorado respondents reported they were most likely to get the vaccine. And at the bottom graph, we see intent to vaccinate varying by race. So Asian respondents were the most likely to indicate they would get the COVID vaccine, followed by white and Hispanic respondents. And Black respondents were the least likely to say they would get a COVID-19 vaccine. And also the only race that indicated that didn't see an increase from October to December in terms of intent to vaccinate. So we looked at a number of other socio-demographic characteristics of intentions to vaccinate. So in this picture, if the estimate and the error bar is to the right of the vertical line at 0, it means that these groups were more likely to report intending to get vaccinated. If it's to the left of the vertical line or less than 0, the group is less likely to get vaccinated. So what you can see here is that respondents with children were less likely to say they'd get vaccinated than respondents without children. Men were more likely to intend to get vaccinated than women. Asian respondents were less hesitant compared to white respondents, and Black respondents were more hesitant than white respondents. Respondents older than 55 were less hesitant to get vaccinated than those under 34. And the likelihood of intending to get vaccinated increased with both age and education. We also see here that liberals were more likely to indicate they would get the vaccine than moderates. And the perceptions of risk that Rob showed you a few slides ago also play an interesting role. So respondents who perceived a higher likelihood of getting COVID-19 and those who thought they were more likely to die if they got it were more likely to say that they did intend to get vaccinated. So in addition to socio-demographic predictors of vaccine hesitancy, we looked at perceptions of the vaccine itself. So we asked respondents, when it comes to a COVID-19 vaccine, how concerned are you about each of the following? And this data is from October that you see here. We saw that respondents primarily were concerned that the vaccine would not be safe or effective. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this changes, again, in our panelists when we look at our December data, which is following some of the safety and efficacy data that came out from various vaccines, including the Pfizer and Moderna, which were widely reported on. And we also asked respondents in our survey to indicate their level of trust in various people and institutions that are playing a role in vaccine development and distribution. So 58% of our respondents indicated that they trusted scientists working on the COVID vaccine. 37% indicated that they trusted pharmaceutical companies, and only 17% indicated that they trusted the government when it comes to a COVID vaccine. And this is interesting, especially when we think about the communication and language around Operation Warp Speed, the role of the government and the Trump administration in promoting vaccine development. And as Chris showed you, a lot of that was in the works, well before the current pandemic. And so it's interesting to think about kind of how people trust the science. And we again see some ideological differences there as well. So in our October survey, 71% of liberals say they trusted scientists working on the COVID-19 vaccine compared to 52% of conservatives. And meanwhile, 10% of liberals and 28% of conservatives said they trusted the government when it comes to COVID-19 vaccine. So it's really interesting to look at those trust differences as well. And those trust differences fit really well with the data shown here, which is how respondents view the job done by various stakeholders, various entities in handling the pandemic. So in this October data, we saw strong approval for scientists and Dr. Fauci, and that was consistent kind of across our waves, and high levels of disapproval for President Trump's handling of the pandemic. Support for local government and especially local school districts has increased since August. So in this October data, roughly 51% either approved or strongly approved of how their local governments were handling the pandemic. And approval of local school districts had increased actually to 46% in October as compared to 35% in our August wave. And that's interesting as a number of students return to partial or full in-person classes. So now I'm going to turn it back to Rob to share some of the important policy implications of this work and also the next steps for our work together.
Great. So as I indicated at the outset, we're a team that is dedicated not just to collecting data and informing scholarly research, but actually doing work that can help make a difference and begin to turn the tides in favor of more vaccine uptake. And so the question becomes, how promising is a vaccine if people aren't willing to take it? And this is exactly the question that our team recently weighed in on in a recent op-ed that we published in Newsweek. And really, our op-ed centered on identifying a number of suggestions for the Biden administration, which really has a tall task ahead of it in making sure that Americans take this vaccine in the coming months. And we focused on three main suggestions, all of which are grounded in findings from the data that Danielle just presented. And indeed, I would say some of the data that Chris presented in his presentation as well. First, as Chris noted, it's absolutely imperative that policymakers, indeed anyone who talks about COVID-19 vaccination, try to take steps to depoliticize the vaccine development and distribution process. Our data implies that putting scientists in charge of efficacy and safety decisions is an absolutely critical first step in this, whether that means making FDA findings available to the general public, whether that means having scientists out front in public hearings and briefings on a vaccine. These are individuals that Americans trust, and so therefore it's important that they play a role in communicating these efficacy and safety issues to the general public. This also involves transparency around approval and vaccine distribution processes. As many of you may have read in today's Boston Globe, the state is set to see its allotment of the Pfizer vaccine cut by about a third in the next shipment. So far, we're not entirely sure what is driving that cut in allotment, but it's very important that because residents are depending on this vaccine to get back to normal, that an explanation comes quickly. And so transparency, not only around how a vaccine is created, but also around these types of supply chain issues is imperative. Secondly, our data suggests that the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is consistent with a wealth of data that's been collected over the last several months, is not affecting everyone equally. And to that end, we suggest that it's essential that the Biden administration overcome the justifiable mistrust of the medical establishment and vaccine hesitancy more specifically among Black and Brown Americans. We should note that this is much different than the quote unquote anti-vaxxer movement that's getting a lot of airtime in the media. This is a distrust that's born out of decades of mistreatment by both the public health and medical community. And given the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on these communities, it's absolutely critical that policymakers create venues and avenues for Black and Brown individuals to communicate their concerns in ways that account for really what amount to decades of mistreatment and in some instances, outright lying by members of the medical establishment. And then finally, it's also important that the messaging around this vaccine be tailored to worldviews and ideologies, and not only focus on things like safety and efficacy alone. So one way to do this is to message the vaccine in ways that emphasize the collective nature of the COVID-19 risk. A message that's particularly salient to this end would be something that says, we all need to do our part to combat COVID-19, which evokes this sort of sense of community in getting vaccinated, as opposed to just focusing on individual concerns. Secondly, a lot of Americans are understandably very concerned about the impact of COVID-19 and COVID-19 related policies on the economy. So promoting the benefits in vaccination as a means of economic growth, or even emphasizing vaccination as a way as a theme of personal responsibility or a duty to protect one's family and friends, is a great way to get at some of those concerns as well. So what's next for the Risk and Social Policy Working Group, and really what's next for social scientific research and indeed scientific research on vaccine hesitancy in the months ahead? I'm happy to report that our team has recently received a second National Science Foundation grant, this time to explicitly look at the impact of the 2020 election and other structural factors on vaccine uptake in the United States. And really, our new wave of surveys are going to be motivated by three distinct, but what we believe are interrelated questions, which are sort of outlined in the model that you can see there on the left. First, we want to understand how COVID vaccine uptake intentions are influenced by an individual's worldview, risk perceptions, and general trust of institutions. Secondly, we want to understand how COVID-19 vaccine uptake intentions are influenced by exogenous events in political and informational environments. And what we mean by exogenous events here include things like changes in a presidential administration, revelations about some of the potential side effects of a vaccine, revelations about the likelihood that a vaccine will be distributed in a timely and efficient process. All of these things we hypothesize can have a profound impact on whether or not someone intends to get a vaccine. And then finally, all of this is occurring within a larger structural environment that is marred by decades of structural racism. So we as a team want to understand how those factors intersect with both politics, worldviews, and then on a more micro level, individual risk perceptions to shape whether or not someone wants to get vaccinated. With that being said, if you're interested in learning more about our work, you can find summary reports of all of our surveys available at www.riskandsocialpolicy.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at riskpolicy. And we pretty regularly update our website. So if you're interested in seeing some of the data from the new vaccine survey, that will probably be coming out in mid to late January, then please check in and it will be there available for you to view. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to fielding some of your questions.
Hi, thank you again for all of this information. As I wanted to review that we will be sharing a recording of today's session with everybody and those who registered, so feel free to send that around to your networks. And Bethany put in the chat Rob's first webinar recording, so back from March 19th, and a lot has happened since then. So we'll get started with some of the questions. You did answer many of the pre-submitted questions, but we still have a few more. And if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and put it in the Q&A box now, and we will get started with asking. So there are a couple of questions that were submitted about, will we ever go back to normal or a new normal? And perhaps making some guesses on how long we might be wearing masks for, because that's, people are saying, you know, even with the vaccine rollout, we'll still be asked to wear masks to keep people safe. I don't know who to ask first, so if you guys want to just jump in. I don't know, Chris, if you want to kick us off.
Sure, yeah, I can talk about some of the questions that are leading specifically to the question of masks specifically. So one of the things that we still don't know is how long the vaccine will remain protective. And the phase 3 trials were conducted on things like non-pregnant participants, 18 years of age and older. And it's going to require thorough investigation of the safety and efficacy of the vaccines in different populations before we know a lot about how it works. In addition, we don't necessarily know if the vaccine protects against the ability to spread to other individuals. And so that's at kind of the core of the debate regarding whether or not people will need to wear masks following administration of the vaccine. Additionally, the last point is that current estimates are you need anywhere between 70 to 80% of the population to be inoculated with a strong source of immunity, which will likely be given through vaccination or through prophylactic or treatment-based administration of antibodies. And so until you reach that point, it's really going to become important that people still take these, what we call non-pharmacological interventions or NPIs to prevent the spread of the virus.
Great.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think there's also a political dimension to what mask wearing in the new normal will look like. As we have seen over the course of the last few months, there's tremendous variance in terms of which states are actually following public health best practices and which states have politicized things like mask wearing and social distancing. So I think the answer to the question of what the new normal will look like will actually depend on what state you're living in. So if you're here in Massachusetts, I think so far we've done a pretty good job following best practices, namely around mask wearing. And actually our data shows very, very high levels of compliance among Massachusetts residents. So I think that, yes, it's possible we'll get to a place where we won't be wearing masks, but that likely will not be for a long time. Whereas in other states that we sampled, Iowa, for example, mask wearing was not mandated, and so you have a lot of reluctance to do so.
And I'll add that, you know, kind of from a behavior change perspective, if we think about one of the strongest predictors of why somebody would engage in a behavior like mask wearing, a health-related behavior, social norms are one of the strongest predictors. So if you think back, maybe your own experience in March and seeing somebody, you know, in a grocery store or out on the street wearing a mask for the first time, how weird that felt, how awkward, how kind of against what you were used to that felt. And you know, now probably for many people, it's the opposite. When you see somebody not wearing a mask out, it triggers that same reaction. And so it's one of the reasons why mask uptake was quicker in some Asian countries, because they had kind of a culture around mask wearing already in place. And so I think it will change how we think about mask wearing. It might change how we think about wearing masks, you know, post-COVID when we're not feeling well. But I do think there'll be a lot of individual and regional and ideological variation in that as well.
All right, we have some lots of questions coming in now. And let's see, okay. If the states that will not comply with the NPI, as you mentioned, Chris, will this continue to allow the virus to continue to surge?
So I think, Rob, that's probably a better question for you, I would think.
If states don't, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? If states don't comply with NPI, did you say?
Yes.
Will it allow? Yes. I mean, I think it will. I mean, I think, really one of the things that we've seen is that non-compliance with public health best practices has negative externalities that spill across state jurisdictions and borders, right? We're a federal system of government, and in some respects, that has been a good check in terms of allowing states that want to be forerunners in conforming to public health best practices despite poor messaging from the top. But on the other hand, that means that when you have states, regions, localities that aren't following best practices, that one way or the other, travel will mean that the virus makes its way to your borders. So I think the idea that an uneven response in compliance with any measure won't have national ramifications is false, right? And this is why President-elect Biden said in his first 100 days, he's going to ask all Americans to wear a mask just for the first 100 days, because it's acknowledging the fact that uneven compliance has deleterious effects for everyone and not just the state that's not complying.
We actually have a recommendation from someone in the audience to say, wear a mask that messages, I've been vaccinated. So there you go. When media reports only share messaging on how safe the vaccine is, it brings up some distrust. And of course, the government wants to get people to participate. So how do you see the best way to communicate or no risks, build trust while still motivating people to take the vaccine? Great question.
I think I can field that one. We know what the best practices are for health communication in times of crisis. We know, as Chris said early, and Rob reiterated, that transparency is crucial, and helping people, kind of knowledge is that first step, right? There's lots of other factors about your individual perceptions, what's going on around you, your ideology, your norms, all the factors that we'll be looking at in the environment. But knowledge is a fundamental first step, and building trust means transparent information from credible sources. And I think one of the problems early on around the vaccine development was messaging that the government was taking a stronger role in it than they maybe actually were. It was messaging around the speed of the process and not communicating, as Chris showed, that this is a process that's been going on since the 60s and 70s, and fueled by really good science, and that enabled us to have kind of this rapid speed, right? So the messaging around warp speed, while it may have been well-intentioned to kind of say this is coming quickly, did fuel that sense of, are we cutting corners? Is there mistrust? And I think if more and more messaging is about kind of the fact that the scientific process, while expedited, was consistent with how we've developed other vaccines, how we do science in general, that will help in that a lot. And I think again, transparency of data, and helping people understand what that data means, right? So when you have results from a clinical trial, if you see side effects, if you see efficacy of 94%, what does that mean, and communicating that in a way that people can understand. And that's really hard to do, but we have best practices from health communication, from risk perception research, to know how to do that. So I think it's really incumbent on the media to use those best practices.
And hopefully that will help some of our other participants who've asked about how they can share to influence those who might be more wary of taking the vaccine. Another question is around vaccine mandates. We've seen here in Massachusetts the mandates around the flu shot. Do you think there will be any mandating citizens to receive the COVID-19 vaccine?
I'm happy to take it. I think yes, and given the mandates around the flu shot, and other vaccines, the state is on pretty solid legal ground for doing that. So I would be shocked if by next fall, maybe there aren't state mandates, and also employers don't have some requirement that you indicate that you got the vaccine. Heck, Bentley this year, I was on sabbatical, but I still got asked, did you get your flu shot, and had to attest to that. So absolutely, I think COVID vaccine mandates are coming, unless of course you have some religious exemption will probably exist still, but yes, I think mandates are coming.
And a practical question for those who are interested in getting the vaccine, but maybe are not at the top of the priority list. How will the average American citizen go about getting the vaccine? Will they need a prescription from their doctor?
I'm happy to take that one too.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that one, Chris? If you want to take it, you can go right ahead.
I'll go after you.
Okay. That's kind of the $1 million question for people who are studying the distribution process. So states have come up with distribution plans. And so far, if you were to look at those plans, they're really a rank ordering around who gets to go first. And they prioritize essential workers, however you want to construe that. I think my definition of an essential worker would probably be a little more broad than most states have defined it, as well as people who are in quote unquote higher risk groups. And I think at least with the essential workers, you have these institutional capture points that make it really easy to vaccinate them. So my sister is an emergency nurse at Boston Medical Center, and her hospital is vaccinating her today, and they've been vaccinating her colleagues around the clock. They come to work and they get the vaccine. I suspect that it's going to be a little more difficult when it comes to the general population, in part because of some of the nuances around storing the vaccine. I know that my healthcare provider recently sent out an email indicating that they're working on distribution plans, so I'm assuming they will play a role. I've also heard rumors that CVS and Walgreens have been contracted by the government to help lead this process. So far, that means that they've largely gone into long-term, or they will be going into long-term care facilities. But I wouldn't be surprised if we get to a place maybe in the late spring, early summer, where you can go to CVS or Walgreens to get it. The bigger question is, how do you track people and make sure they come back to get the vaccine? And I think that's what makes it so much more difficult than, say, your annual flu shot. Chris.
Oh, that was a perfect segue into what I was going to say. Because it does require a booster, one of the biggest issues is it's a production and deployment question that's actually quite difficult to answer. So if you take just the Pfizer and Moderna versions of the vaccine, and there are other versions in the pipeline that aren't necessarily booster formats, but if you take those, the hope is that by the end of the summer, people who want the vaccine will have gotten it. And so we've moved really quickly on the first part, the hardest part, which is making the vaccine. But the most important part, which is the distribution, is the thing that's up in the air. And the big thing is policies are going to change depending on whether or not people take those non-pharmacological interventions seriously. Masking in public, not going to gatherings outside, keeping distance away from others, washing hands, things like that. Because the virus will go kind of where the wind blows to, essentially a human body in which it can reproduce, and it'll reproduce itself and keep going. And so you have to follow the public health data. So it may change the guidelines surrounding what happens in January versus what happens in late spring, early summer.
Right. Well, I feel badly because we have a lot of questions, but we are up against the hour. And I want to give you all just a chance to give some final remarks to our audience this afternoon. Danielle, you want to start with any final comments for our audience?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all so much. And I hope you got a good perspective on kind of the biology, the policy, and I'll comment on kind of the psychology of this distribution, which is this is about people. This is about people making a decision to be vaccinated. This is about the factors that go into that decision. And we have to remember that a vaccine is only as effective as people actually taking it. And so we know a lot from health communication, behavioral science about how to get people to engage in these kind of risk reduction behaviors and get vaccinated. And so hopefully we'll see, in the next 6 months or year that those kind of factors are all being accounted for, and making the process as easy for individuals as possible.
Rob, you want to go next?
Sure. Danielle said all the great stuff, but I will put on my political scientist hat and say that, we're about to have a change in presidential administrations. And hopefully, if we do another one of these webinars in the fall or even the late spring, our lives will be starting to slowly get back to normal. But what I would say is that the time to ask policymakers to start preparing for the next disease outbreak is now. And if there's one lesson that this pandemic revealed, it's that the systems that we have in place to protect us, whether those are systems of messaging, whether those are systems of healthcare access, whether those are systems around basic food security, they're not working as well as we should expect them to work. So if anything, although our lives are going to get back to normal, I hope that all of you remember this and continue to press policymakers to make the types of investments that are needed to prevent another catastrophe like this from happening in the future.
All right, Chris, you want to round us out with your final thoughts?
Sure, I'll use my final thoughts to actually address 3 common questions I get, especially from students. So the first is surrounding public support for basic science research. Hopefully what you saw throughout this is that, it took up to 50 to 60 years of research to really support the rapid development of these vaccines. It's not something that happened in 66 days in the case of the Moderna vaccine. Their work was actually back to 2008. And so public support for basic science research is very important. But even as we go further down the line, when we think about venture capital, when we think about companies actually going public and actually being responsible to their shareholders, support for basic science research continues throughout the development cycle, and it's something that should be advocated for by all citizens. The second thing is regarding whether or not, if you've gotten COVID-19, should you take the vaccine? Right now, early info suggests that the vaccine will elicit any stronger and more varied immune response than natural infection. So yes, I would encourage you that if you've had it, go ahead and take the vaccine. The third thing is, will I take the vaccine? And I'll say that the answer is yes. I will allow people who are more at risk and who are higher in priority to take it first. The thing is, I don't have any issues with the efficacy. I have issues about the long-term immunity. And so that's something that we'll figure out in these clinical trials.
Well, I'll have to have you back to give us a progress update on those as time goes along. Thank you 3 so much again for giving us your time. We are so appreciative to have faculty who are willing to participate with the community and share all of your research and your thoughts. And we are grateful to all of you for tuning in. So thank you, and please join us again in 2021.